The moment between 1 year and the next lasts exactly 1 second. But for some people, that second changed everything. What you're about to hear are real stories from real people who thought they were celebrating. Instead, they found themselves trapped, hunted, and fighting to survive. These aren't ghost stories. These are worse, because the monsters in these stories are real. They walk among us. They wait for moments when we're distracted by fireworks and champagne, when we're focused on countdowns instead of the footsteps behind us. Before we start, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now turn off your lights, put in your headphones, and whatever you do, don't watch this alone. Because after tonight, you'll never look at New Year's Eve the same way again. Story number 1. The Invasion. I need you to understand something right now. When you see a stranger at a party, your brain makes a quick decision. Friend or threat? Safe or dangerous? That decision takes maybe 2 seconds. On New Year's Eve 2024, my brain made the wrong call, and it almost got me killed. My name is Marcus, and I was 28 years old when this happened. I had driven 5 hours from Nashville to Atlanta to celebrate with my best friend Brienne at her Victorian house near Grant Park. Big house, 6 bedrooms, wraparound porches, the kind of place that feels safe because it's full of people and noise and life. By 10 p.m., maybe 80 people packed that house. I was in the kitchen talking to a guy named Jerome, drinking whiskey, feeling genuinely happy for the first time in months. The music was loud. People were dancing. Strangers kept introducing themselves with that easy New Year's energy where everyone's your friend for one night. That's when I saw them. 6 people I didn't recognize. 4 guys, 2 women, all in their late 20s. They looked normal enough. Nice clothes, confident smiles. But something was off. One guy had a shaved head and a neck tattoo that disappeared under his collar. He kept scanning the rooms like he was taking inventory. His eyes moved in quick, systematic sweeps while his friends laughed and grabbed drinks. I told myself they were just new arrivals, friends of friends, part of that endless chain of connections that had filled the house. I watched them split up. 2 headed downstairs. 2 drifted toward the bedrooms. 2 stayed near the front door. Looking back, I can see they were positioning themselves like chess pieces. At the time, I just thought they were exploring. The countdown started at 11:58. Everyone crowded into the living room with champagne and plastic cups raised high. Brienne climbed onto a chair, her face flushed and happy, leading the chant. 10, 9, 8. The whole room vibrated with voices shouting in unison. When we hit 0, confetti exploded from the ceiling. People screamed and hugged and kissed whoever stood closest. The champagne tasted like victory, like every cliché about fresh starts that I desperately needed to believe. Somewhere in that chaos, those 6 strangers were locking doors and pulling guns from under their jackets. The first scream came from the basement around 12:15. Most people thought it was just someone celebrating too hard. The music kept pumping. Conversations kept flowing. I had wandered back to the kitchen to grab water because the whiskey was making my head swim. That's when the guy with the neck tattoo walked in holding a pistol. Behind him came one of the women with a sawed-off shotgun resting against her hip. He didn't yell. He just pointed the gun at me and said very calmly, "Get on the floor, face down, hands behind your head." His voice had no emotion in it, no anger, just the flat tone of someone following a script they'd rehearsed 100 times. I dropped so fast my knees cracked against the tile. Within seconds, 3 other people hit the floor beside me. A girl in a sequin dress crying quietly. 2 guys asking what was happening, what the hell was happening. The woman with the shotgun stood by the doorway while her partner zip-tied our wrists behind our backs. He pulled the plastic so tight I could feel my pulse throbbing in my fingertips. That's when the screaming started for real. It spread through the house like wildfire as the other members revealed themselves in different rooms. Furniture crashed. Heavy footsteps thundered across the old hardwood. Voices shouted commands. Get down. Shut up. Hand it over. From my position on the kitchen floor, cheek pressed against cold tile that smelled like spilled beer, I could only see boots moving back and forth. I could hear the chaos unfolding in fragments. Someone sobbing, glass shattering, a grown man crying in the next room. The guy with the neck tattoo crouched beside me and pressed the barrel of his gun against the base of my skull. The metal was so cold it burned. He asked where the safe was. I told him I didn't live here. I was just visiting. I didn't know about any safe. He pressed harder, grinding the barrel into my scalp. His breath smelled like cigarettes and rum punch. He asked again, Brienne. The thought of her hit me like a punch to the chest. I had no idea where she was, if she was safe, if she was hurt, if she was even alive. The guy must have seen something change in my face because he laughed, this low chuckle with no humor in it. He told me not to worry about my friends. He said I should worry about myself, about giving them what they wanted so everyone could go home with all their fingers attached. That specific detail, the fingers, made something inside me go very still and very cold. They herded all of us into the living room over the next 20 minutes. Maybe 60 people forced to sit on the floor with our backs against the walls while 2 of them stood guard with weapons drawn. The DJ booth had been knocked over. Champagne glasses we'd raised at midnight now lay shattered in glittering piles that cut into people's legs when they shifted position. I found Brienne across the room, mascara streaking her face, a bruise already forming on her left cheekbone where someone had hit her. Our eyes met and she mouthed something I couldn't understand, but I nodded to let her know I was alive. One woman near the window refused to give up her engagement ring, said it was her grandmother's. One of the guys pistol whipped her so hard she collapsed sideways into the person next to her. Blood poured from her head. Someone vomited on the floor. Someone had called 911 before the phones were collected. A guy named Dennis, hiding in the basement bathroom, crouched behind the toilet with his phone's brightness turned down. He whispered the address to the dispatcher, begged them to send help. But it was New Year's Eve in Atlanta. Every cop was dealing with drunk drivers, bar fights, domestic disputes. The dispatcher said units were responding, but it might take time. Dennis stayed on the line for 11 minutes before one of them found him. They kicked in the bathroom door and dragged him upstairs by his collar. Then they made an example of him in front of everyone. They beat him with the butt of a rifle until his face became unrecognizable. A mess of blood and swelling that made several people vomit. The message was clear. This is what happens to heroes. I kept my eyes on the hardwood, counting the grain patterns, trying to disappear into myself. Minutes stretched into something elastic and terrible. Time lost all meaning when every second feels like it might be your last. The leader kept checking his watch and exchanging glances with his second in command. They had expected to be done by now, in and out before anyone could respond. But the sheer number of people had slowed them down. The sirens came at 1:47 in the morning, distant at first, then growing louder until they surrounded the house from every direction. I'll never forget the way the leader's face changed when he heard them, that calm mask cracking into something raw and furious. He started shouting orders. His crew scrambled to grab the duffel bags stuffed with our belongings. For one horrible moment, I thought they were going to start shooting us. But the leader made a different call. He grabbed Brienne by the hair and yanked her to her feet, announced they were taking insurance with them. 2 others grabbed a man I didn't recognize and a kindergarten teacher named Valerie with a glittery tiara now stained with blood. They dragged all 3 toward the back of the house while the rest covered their retreat. I screamed Brienne's name so loud my throat tore. She looked back at me once, her eyes wide with terror, before she disappeared through the kitchen doorway. The police found the 3 hostages 2 hours later, abandoned in a stolen van behind a strip mall 6 miles away. The robbers had vanished into the chaos of celebrations still raging across the city. Brienne didn't speak for 3 days, just sat in her hospital bed staring at the wall with hollowed-out eyes. Dennis survived but needed reconstructive surgery. The woman who got pistol-whipped had a fractured skull. 2 weeks in the ICU. Police arrested 2 of the 6 about 3 weeks later. Caught them pawning jewelry in Savannah. But the others were never found, including the man with the neck tattoo. I drove back to Nashville 4 days later, my wrist still bruised purple from the zip ties. I didn't leave my apartment for a month. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that kitchen floor, felt that cold metal against my skull, heard Brienne screaming as they dragged her away. It's been almost a year now. I still can't go to parties. Still flinch when I hear fireworks or champagne corks popping. Some people say time heals everything, but I think that's something people tell themselves so they can sleep at night. Some wounds just become part of you, woven into who you are, and you learn to carry them because the alternative is to stop moving entirely. Story number 2. The Watcher. Nicole and I had been together for 3 years when New Year's Eve 2017 came around. We were living in Boise, Idaho, both working jobs that barely paid rent. She was a vet tech. I did IT support. That December had been brutal for both of us. So when Nicole suggested we skip the downtown crowds and find somewhere quiet to watch fireworks, it sounded perfect. I knew about Ridgeline Point, a spot about 40 minutes outside the city, up a winding mountain road. A small overlook with a clear view of the valley below. My coworker said he used to take his wife there when they were dating. The drive up was quiet. Just the hum of my old Ford Ranger and acoustic music from Nicole's phone. We passed the last gas station around 9 p.m. After that, nothing but dark pines and reflective signs warning about deer. When we pulled into the gravel lot, we were completely alone. City lights glittered far below like scattered gems. Above us, the sky was impossibly clear, packed with stars you never see in the city. Nicole squeezed my hand and said this was exactly what she needed. I turned off the engine and we sat in the dark, waiting for midnight. We had hot chocolate, a blanket, hand warmers. For the first 20 minutes, everything was perfect. We talked about the year behind us, about the apartment we wanted to move into in spring, about her sister's wedding. Around 11:15, I noticed it. A light, small and pale, off to our left where the tree line began. At first I thought it was a reflection, but then it moved. Just a small shift, but enough to make me sit up straighter. Nicole was mid-sentence about her bridesmaid dress when she noticed me staring. She asked what was wrong. I told her I thought I saw something, probably just an animal. She leaned over to look and the light disappeared. We sat in silence, both scanning the dark edge of the forest. Nicole laughed nervously and said it was probably a hiker with a headlamp. Someone who had the same idea we did. That made sense. It was New Year's Eve. People do strange things. But something about the way that light had moved, deliberate and slow, made the back of my neck prickle. About 5 minutes later, I saw it again. Closer this time, maybe 30 feet from where it had been. And this time it stayed on long enough for me to see it wasn't a headlamp. It was the glow of a phone screen held low, illuminating the bottom half of a face. Someone was standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. Nicole saw it too. She grabbed my arm so hard her nails dug through my jacket. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't call out. Just stood there, maybe 60 yards away, half hidden by a massive pine. The phone light clicked off before I could see anything else. Nicole whispered that we should leave right now. I agreed. I reached for the keys and turned them. The engine made a sound I'd never heard before. A weak, stuttering cough that died almost immediately. I tried again. Same thing. The dashboard lights flickered for half a second and went dark. The truck was dead. Nicole asked what was happening, her voice climbing higher. I told her I didn't know. I pumped the gas, turned the key, got nothing but a hollow click. I need to be clear about something. That Ford Ranger was old, sure. A 2004 with over 160,000 miles. But I just had the battery replaced 2 months before. It had started fine when we left. There was no warning, no slow crank, nothing. One moment it was running. The next it was completely dead, like someone had flipped a switch. Nicole was breathing fast beside me, her eyes fixed on the tree line. I told her to stay calm, that maybe it was the cold, that I'd pop the hood and take a look. But when I reached for the door handle, she grabbed my wrist hard and said, "No, don't get out of the truck." She pointed toward the trees. The figure had moved. It was no longer at the tree line. It was standing in the middle of the gravel lot, maybe 40 feet from our front bumper, completely still. No phone light this time, just a dark silhouette against the faint glow of the city below, watching us with what I can only describe as patience. Nicole fumbled for her phone, fingers trembling. I kept my eyes on the figure, afraid that if I looked away even for a second, it would be at my window when I looked back. She tried to call 911, but the call wouldn't connect. No signal. Too far from any cell tower. I tried my phone. Same result. We were completely cut off. The figure still hadn't moved, hadn't said a word, and somehow that was worse than if it had charged at us screaming. There was something calculating about the stillness, like a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to go. Nicole started crying. Quiet sobs she tried to muffle with her hand. I put my arm around her and told her we'd be okay. But I didn't believe it. Then the figure took a step forward. Slow, deliberate, almost casual, like someone out for an evening stroll. Then another step, and another. I laid on the horn, pressing as hard as I could. Nothing happened. No sound. Whatever killed the battery had killed everything. Nicole screamed at me to do something. I felt completely useless. I reached under my seat and my fingers closed around a tire iron I'd forgotten was there. Not much, but something. I told Nicole that if this thing got to us, I was going to fight. She nodded, mascara running down her cheeks, and grabbed the thermos. Heavy stainless steel. Better than nothing. The figure was maybe 20 feet away now, close enough that I could make out more details. A man, tall, wearing a dark canvas jacket and work boots. His face was still obscured by shadow, but I could see his hands hanging loose at his sides. He wasn't holding anything. What kind of person approaches a stranded couple in the middle of nowhere at night with empty hands and no words? He was 10 feet from the hood when headlights swept across the lot. For a split second, the man was fully illuminated. Pale skin, gaunt face with hollow cheeks, eyes that reflected the light like an animal caught on a highway. The headlights belonged to a Jeep Wrangler coming up the mountain road. The driver must have seen us because the vehicle slowed as it entered the lot. The man in the canvas jacket didn't run. He didn't even flinch. He simply turned and walked back toward the tree line with that same unhurried pace. Disappeared into the darkness between the pines. The Jeep pulled up beside us and the window rolled down. A woman in her 50s with short gray hair and a concerned expression. She asked if we were okay. Said she saw someone walking away from our truck. I've never been so relieved to see a stranger in my entire life. I told her our truck wouldn't start, that we'd been stranded, that there was a man watching us from the woods. Her expression changed immediately, shifted from concern to something harder, more alert. She told us to get in her Jeep, that she'd drive us down to the gas station and we could call for a tow. Nicole was already opening her door. We grabbed our phones and climbed into the back seat. The woman, her name was Connie, locked the doors the moment we were inside and didn't waste time pulling out of that lot. As we drove away, I looked back through the rear window. The gravel lot was empty, the truck sitting dark and abandoned. But at the very edge of the tree line, just for a moment, I saw him again, standing motionless, watching us leave. And even from that distance, even through the glass, I could swear he was smiling. Connie drove us down the mountain without saying much. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror like she expected to see headlights following us. When we reached the gas station, she parked right under the brightest light and came inside with us while I called the police. 2 officers showed up about 20 minutes later. We told them everything. They took notes and said they'd send a patrol car up to check it out. One officer pulled me aside and asked if I wanted them to arrange a tow that night. I said yes. There was no way I was going back up that mountain in the dark. The tow truck arrived around 1 a.m. The driver, a heavy guy named Sal who smelled like cigarettes and coffee, agreed to let me ride along while Nicole stayed at the gas station with Connie. When we got to the overlook, the lot was empty. No sign of the man. But when Sal popped the hood to hook up the cables, he stopped and called me over with a flashlight. Someone had cut my battery cables, both of them, clean through with what Sal said looked like bolt cutters or heavy-duty shears. He showed me the ends, not frayed, not worn, sliced at an angle, deliberate and precise. That's why the truck had died so completely. No slow crank, no warning. Whoever that man was, he'd been in that parking lot before we even noticed him. He'd walked up to my truck while we sat inside drinking hot chocolate, and he'd disabled our only means of escape. Sal looked at me with an expression I'll never forget, a mixture of pity and fear. He said I was lucky that Jeep showed up when it did. I couldn't argue with him. The police never found the man. They searched the area, put out a description, but he was gone like smoke. Connie told us before she left that she only drove up to Ridgeline Point that night because she'd missed her exit on the highway and decided to take the scenic route home. A wrong turn. That was all that stood between us and whatever that man had planned. Nicole and I moved to Portland 3 months later. We sold the Ranger to a junkyard and bought a newer car with working locks and an alarm system. We never went back to Ridgeline Point, and we stopped watching fireworks from anywhere that wasn't surrounded by hundreds of other people. Sometimes late at night, I still think about that man standing in the gravel lot, watching us with those hollow eyes, waiting. I think about how calm he was, how patient, like he'd done this before and knew exactly how it would go. I think about what would have happened if Connie hadn't missed her exit, if those headlights had come 5 minutes later, or not at all. The police called me a few weeks after, said they'd found an abandoned campsite in the woods near the overlook. A tent, some canned food, a sleeping bag that looked like it had been used for months. They also found a duffel bag with duct tape, zip ties, and a hunting knife with a 9-inch blade. No fingerprints, no ID, nothing that could tell them who he was or where he went. The detectives said they suspected he'd been living up there for a while, waiting for the right opportunity, waiting for someone like us. I thanked him for the update, hung up the phone, and sat in the dark for a long time. Nicole found me there an hour later and we held each other without saying a word. Some things don't need to be spoken. You just carry them with you, quiet and heavy, for the rest of your life. Story number 3. The Wrong Door. New Year's Eve 2023 is something I still think about almost every single day. I'd moved into my apartment complex in Atlanta about 3 months before. One of those massive buildings where every floor looks exactly the same and every door is the same shade of gray. My unit was 4B, 4th floor, second door on the left after you exit the elevator. That night, coworkers from the warehouse invited me to a party in Midtown. I figured why not? I had no other plans and my family lives back in Virginia. I took an Uber around 9 p.m., already buzzed from beers I'd had at home. The party was packed. Loud music, people everywhere. Drinks kept flowing like nobody was keeping track. By midnight, I'd lost count of how many whiskeys I'd downed. I left around 2 a.m., maybe closer to 2:30. My phone was almost dead. Barely enough battery to request an Uber back home. The driver dropped me off at my complex, or what I thought was my complex. I stumbled through the entrance, feeling that heavy drunk tiredness where all you want is your bed. The lobby looked right. Same tile floors, same mailboxes, same elevator with scratched metal doors. I pressed the button for the 4th floor and leaned against the wall, eyes half closed. When the doors opened, I walked out and turned left like I always do, counting doors until I reached what I believed was 4B. I pulled out my keys and shoved one into the lock. When it didn't turn, I just assumed my coordination was garbage. I tried again, wiggling it, pushing the door a little. Then I heard a click. The door opened. In my wasted state, I didn't question it. I just walked inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't my apartment. My place smells like cheap air freshener, that fake ocean breeze scent. This place smelled like cigarettes and something else, maybe fried food or old grease. But my drunk brain didn't process it as a warning. I just thought maybe I'd left some food out. The layout was identical to mine. Small entryway leading into the living room, kitchen to the right, hallway to the bedrooms on the left. I didn't turn on lights because I never do when I come home late. I just navigate by the glow from parking lot lights outside. I kicked off my shoes near the door and started walking toward what I thought was my bedroom. The furniture was in different spots. I bumped my shin hard against a coffee table that shouldn't have been there. I cursed under my breath. Still, nothing clicked in my head. Too drunk, too tired, too focused on getting to bed. I made it about halfway down the hallway when I heard movement. A shuffling sound. Then a door opening. I stopped walking. Not scared, just confused. I lived alone. There shouldn't be anyone else here. Before I could form a thought, a light flicked on. I was staring at a man I'd never seen before. Older than me, maybe in his 50s, wearing boxer shorts and a white tank top. And he was holding a baseball bat with both hands raised, ready to swing at my head. His eyes were wide, bloodshot. I could see fear and rage mixing in his face. He screamed something at me. I don't remember what exactly. Something about getting out of his house. Who the hell was I? That's when my brain finally caught up. I wasn't in my apartment. I was in a stranger's home, and he thought I was there to rob him. Or worse. I put my hands up immediately, trying to show I wasn't a threat. But the words coming out of my mouth were slurred and made no sense. I kept saying I was sorry, that I thought this was my place, that I lived in 4B. He wasn't listening. He kept screaming, backing me toward the wall, that bat never lowering an inch. I could see his arms shaking, not from weakness, from pure adrenaline. Behind him, a woman appeared, probably his wife. She was screaming too, telling him to call the police, asking who I was, what I wanted. The noise was overwhelming. My head pounded from the alcohol and now from the panic flooding my system. I tried to take a step back. My foot caught on something, maybe a shoe or a rug. I stumbled. That small movement, that tiny loss of balance, was almost the end of me. The man swung. I don't think he meant to kill me, but in that moment, with that much fear pumping through him, he wasn't thinking straight either. The bat came down and I twisted my body just enough that it caught my left shoulder instead of my head. The pain was immediate and blinding, like someone had set my entire arm on fire. I hit the ground hard, my face smacking against hardwood. I tasted blood in my mouth. I think I bit my tongue when I fell. The woman was still screaming, and now I was screaming too, begging him to stop, telling him over and over it was a mistake, that I was drunk, that I got the wrong apartment. He stood over me with the bat raised again, breathing heavy. I genuinely believed those were going to be my last seconds alive. I remember looking up at him and seeing this look in his eyes, this terrified confusion, like he didn't know what to do next. We were both trapped in this nightmare that neither of us had asked for. The woman finally did something that probably saved my life. She grabbed her husband's arm and pulled him back, yelling at him to wait, to not hit me again, that she'd already called 911. I stayed on the ground, curled up, holding my shoulder, crying like a child. The pain was so intense I couldn't think, couldn't move, couldn't do anything except lay there and repeat that I was sorry. The man stood a few feet away, still gripping that bat, still breathing like he'd just run a marathon. Nobody said anything for what felt like hours but was probably only a minute or two. I could hear sirens in the distance, getting closer. I felt this strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because the police meant this guy wouldn't beat me to death, but dread because I had no idea how I was going to explain any of this. I was drunk. I'd entered someone's home uninvited, and from their perspective, I was an intruder who could have been there to hurt them. The cops arrived fast. Maybe 5 or 6 minutes after the call, I heard them banging on the door, announcing themselves. The woman went to let them in. 2 officers came into the hallway with their guns drawn, shouting commands. I just stayed on the floor with my hands visible. I'd seen enough news stories to know how badly things can go when police show up to a reported break-in. They handcuffed me first, which hurt like hell because of my shoulder, then started asking questions. The man and woman were both talking over each other, explaining that they woke up to find me inside, that they thought I was a burglar. I tried to tell my side, but I was still slurring, probably making things worse. One officer checked my wallet, saw my ID, then asked me what my address was. When I told him, he looked at me with this expression I'll never forget, like he was trying to figure out if I was lying or just incredibly stupid. He asked if I knew where I was. I said 4B, 4th floor. He shook his head and told me I was in Building C, not Building B. Same apartment number, same floor, different building entirely. The complex where I lived had 4 identical buildings arranged in a square around a central parking lot. Building A, B, C, and D, all looking exactly the same. The Uber driver had dropped me off at the wrong entrance, and in my drunken haze, I hadn't noticed. I walked into Building C thinking it was Building B, went up to the 4th floor, found apartment 4B, and somehow the door had been unlocked. The officer asked the couple if they'd locked their door before bed. The woman's face went pale. She admitted they'd come home from a New Year's party themselves, also pretty drunk, and she couldn't remember if she'd turned the deadbolt. That one small oversight, that one moment of forgetfulness, had led to all of this. The man who'd hit me was sitting on the couch now, his face in his hands. I could see his shoulders trembling. I think he was crying too. He thought he was protecting his home, his wife, his life. He thought I was someone coming to hurt them. Paramedics showed up and examined my shoulder, said it wasn't broken, just badly bruised, but I should go to the hospital to get it properly checked. The officers took statements from everyone. The whole time I kept apologizing, kept trying to explain, kept feeling like the biggest idiot on the planet. The man, whose name I learned was Gregory, eventually came over to where I was sitting. He didn't say much, just stood there looking at me with these tired, sad eyes. Then he said he was sorry for hitting me. I told him I understood, that I would have done the same thing if I woke up to find a stranger in my home. We just looked at each other for a moment. Two people who'd been thrown into a violent confrontation because of stupid mistakes and bad luck. Neither of us wanted to be there. Neither of us had meant for any of this to happen. But it happened anyway, and now we both had to live with it. The police decided not to charge me. They could see it was a genuine mistake. And Gregory confirmed he didn't want to press charges. His wife, Marlene, even offered to drive me to the hospital. But I declined. I just wanted to get out of there. One officer walked me out of the building and pointed toward Building B. My actual building, just about 50 feet away. 50 feet. That's all the distance between where I was supposed to be and where I ended up. I walked to my real apartment in a daze, my shoulder throbbing, my mouth still tasting like blood. When I got to my door, I just stood there for a long time, staring at the number 4B, thinking about how different things could have been. If Gregory had aimed for my head instead of my shoulder, if he'd swung harder, if they'd owned a gun instead of a bat, I could have died that night over a wrong turn and an unlocked door. The thought made my legs feel weak. I had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. I went to the hospital the next morning. They confirmed what the paramedics said. Just severe bruising. Nothing broken. The physical pain faded after a few weeks, but the rest of it stayed with me much longer. I moved out of that complex 2 months later. I couldn't stand looking at those identical buildings anymore, knowing that one of them held a couple who would probably never forget the night a stranger stumbled into their home. I still don't drink the way I used to. I check every door twice before I walk through it now. And sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about Gregory standing over me with that bat. And I think about how close I came to not waking up on New Year's Day. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't some horror movie plot. It was just life, random and cruel. A chain of small mistakes that almost ended with me dead on a stranger's floor. That's the part that scares me the most. There was no villain, no monster, just two drunk couples, for identical buildings, and one unlocked door. Story number 4, The Unwanted Guest. If someone had told me that my first morning of 2018 would involve barricading myself in a bathroom while a stranger paced outside my door, I would have laughed in their face. But let me start from the beginning. I'd graduated college the previous spring and landed my first real job at an insurance company downtown, finally making enough to split rent on a decent 2-bedroom apartment with my roommate Trisha. We'd spent the earlier part of the evening at a massive house party thrown by a coworker named Jerome. The kind of party where you lose track of time and suddenly realize it's nearly 2 a.m. When the crowd started thinning and Jerome began making hints about wanting to crash, a smaller group of us decided to keep celebrating at our place. Felt like a great idea at the time. Trisha and I, plus our friends Andy and Simone, grabbed champagne from the kitchen and called a ride share. We figured we'd watch ball drop replays, play music, and ease into the new year with people we actually liked. The problem walked through our door about 40 minutes after we got home. Andy had mentioned he ran into some guy named Wallace at the party, someone he vaguely knew from a flag football league that dissolved 2 years prior. I never got the full story of how Wallace ended up tagging along. But suddenly there he was, stepping into our living room with a half-empty bottle of whiskey and a grin that seemed too wide for the situation. He was tall, maybe 6 feet 3 inches, with a shaved head and these pale gray eyes that never seemed to blink at a normal rate. The first thing he said wasn't hello or Happy New Year. It was a comment about how our apartment smelled like vanilla and cinnamon. How that reminded him of his grandmother's house before she died. I forced a polite laugh and glanced at Trisha. She gave me a look that said she was already counting the minutes until the stranger would leave. None of us knew yet that he had no intention of leaving at all. For the first hour, Wallace was just awkward. He laughed too loud at jokes that weren't funny, interrupted conversations to share random facts about himself, kept refilling his glass even though nobody offered. He told us he worked in pharmaceutical sales, then later said he was between jobs, then even later mentioned something about a lawsuit against a former employer. The details never quite added up, but we were all tipsy enough to let it slide. What bothered me more was how he moved through the apartment like he owned it. He opened our refrigerator without asking, commented on the leftovers inside, picked up framed photos from the shelf and studied them too closely. At one point, he wandered down the hallway toward the bedrooms. I had to call out that the bathroom was the other direction. He smiled at me when he came back, but there was no apology in it. Just this flat acknowledgement that he'd been caught doing something he knew he shouldn't be doing. By 3:30, Simone was asleep on the love seat. Andy was fading fast on the floor with a throw pillow under his head. Trisha and I exchanged glances across the room, both of us exhausted and ready for the night to end. I stood up and stretched, made a show of yawning loudly, hoping Wallace would take the hint. Instead, he settled deeper into the armchair and kicked off his shoes, revealing mismatched socks, one black, one dark green, and feet that looked like they hadn't seen soap in days. I cleared my throat and said something about how it was getting really late, how we all had to be up in the morning. Wallace just nodded slowly, his pale eyes fixed on the television even though the screen had gone dark 10 minutes ago. He said he wasn't tired yet, that he was a night owl, that he'd just hang out for a little while longer if that was cool with us. The way he said it made clear he wasn't actually asking for permission. Trisha tried next. She was always better at being direct. She stood up and said it was time for everyone to head out, that she'd call a cab for whoever needed one. Andy stirred on the floor and mumbled something about crashing on the couch, which was fine because Andy was practically family. But Wallace didn't move. He just tilted his head slightly and said he didn't have anywhere to go tonight, that his roommate had changed the locks while he was out and he couldn't get back in until morning. The story sounded rehearsed, like he'd used it before in situations exactly like this one. Trisha asked if he had any friends he could call, any family nearby. Wallace shook his head slowly, and for a moment, his expression shifted into something that almost looked like pity, not for himself, but for us, as if we were the ones who didn't understand how this was going to go. He said he'd just sleep in the chair, that we wouldn't even know he was there. His voice had dropped to something quieter, almost gentle, and that scared me more than if he had shouted. I pulled Trisha into the kitchen under the pretense of cleaning up. We whispered back and forth, trying to figure out what to do. Calling the police felt like an overreaction. The guy was weird, sure, but he hadn't technically done anything threatening. We thought about waking Andy and having him deal with it since Wallace was supposedly his acquaintance. But Andy was barely conscious. Trisha suggested we just go to our rooms and lock our doors. Let Wallace sit in the living room all night if that's what he wanted. Deal with kicking him out in the morning when we were sober and rested. It seemed like the safest option, the path of least resistance. I grabbed my phone from the counter and we walked back into the living room to say goodnight. But when we got there, Wallace was no longer in the armchair. He was standing in the middle of the hallway that led to our bedrooms, his back to us, perfectly still, like he was listening for something on the other side of one of the closed doors. I asked him what he was doing. My voice came out sharper than I intended. Wallace turned around slowly, For a second, his face was completely blank, like a mask that hadn't decided what expression to wear yet. Then he smiled and said he was just looking for the bathroom again, that he'd forgotten which door it was. The bathroom door was wide open with the light on. He'd walked past it to get where he was standing. Trisha told him firmly that the bathroom was right there, pointed at it, asked him to please stay in the living room for the rest of the night. Wallace held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender, walked back toward us, but he moved slowly, deliberately, making sure we had to step aside to let him pass. As he brushed by me, I caught a smell coming off him that I hadn't noticed before, something sour underneath the whiskey, like old sweat and something metallic. He sat back down in the armchair and picked up a magazine from the coffee table, flipping through it like nothing had happened. But his eyes weren't reading. They were watching us over the top of the pages. Trisha and I retreated to her bedroom since it had a lock on the door and mine didn't. We left Andy and Simone sleeping in the living room, which I still feel guilty about, but at the time we were operating on pure survival instinct. Trisha pushed her dresser in front of the door. We sat on her bed with our phones in our hands, too wired to sleep. We could hear Wallace moving around in the apartment, the creak of floorboards, the sound of cabinets opening and closing in the kitchen, the refrigerator door. At one point, we heard him try the handle of the bathroom door, then the handle of my bedroom door, each one a soft click followed by silence. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Trisha texted Andy to wake up and check on things, but his phone just buzzed somewhere in the living room with no response. We considered climbing out the window, but we were on the 4th floor and the fire escape was on the other side of the building. So we just sat there, listening, waiting for the sun to come up. Sometime around 5 a.m., the sound stopped. The apartment went completely quiet, and that silence was almost worse than the noises had been. Trisha and I whispered back and forth about whether he'd finally fallen asleep or left or was just standing somewhere in the dark, waiting. We must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember is waking up to gray winter light coming through the blinds, and the sound of voices in the living room. I checked my phone. It was almost 8 a.m. Trisha was already awake, her eyes red and puffy. She pressed a finger to her lips before carefully moving the dresser away from the door. We opened it just a crack and listened. I could hear Andy talking, his voice confused and groggy, asking someone where his jacket was. And then I heard Wallace, calm as anything, saying he'd moved it to the coat closet because it was blocking the heater, like he lived there, like he had every right to reorganize our belongings. Trisha and I looked at each other. I saw my own exhausted fury reflected in her face. This was over. We were ending it now. We walked into the living room together. The scene that greeted us made my chest tight with anger. Wallace was sitting at our small dining table, eating a bowl of cereal, our cereal from our cabinet with our milk, scrolling through his phone like it was any normal morning. Simone was awake now too, sitting on the edge of the love seat, looking deeply uncomfortable, her purse clutched in her lap like she was ready to bolt. Andy was standing by the window with his arms crossed. I could tell from his expression that he'd finally realized something was very wrong. When Wallace saw us, he lifted his spoon in a little wave, said good morning, asked if we'd slept well, mentioned that we were almost out of milk. I walked straight to the front door and opened it wide. The cold January air rushed in. I told Wallace it was time for him to leave. My voice was shaking, but I didn't care anymore. He looked at me for a long moment, chewing slowly. Then he asked where exactly I expected him to go. That's when Andy finally stepped up. He moved toward the table and told Wallace in a firm voice that he needed to leave right now. that this wasn't his apartment and he'd overstayed his welcome by about 6 hours. Wallace set down his spoon and leaned back in the chair, looking between all of us like he was calculating something. For a terrible second, I thought he was going to refuse, that we'd have to physically remove him or call the police after all. But then something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition that he'd pushed this as far as it could go. He stood up slowly, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, walked toward the door without saying a word. As he passed me, he stopped and leaned in close enough that I could smell that sour metallic scent again. He whispered that he'd had a really nice time, that maybe he'd see me around the neighborhood sometime. Then he stepped out into the hallway. I slammed the door behind him so hard the pictures on the wall rattled. Tricia threw the deadbolt and the chain lock while I stood there with my back against the door, breathing like I'd just run a marathon. None of us spoke for a while. Simone left almost immediately, hugging us quickly and practically running to her car. Andy kept apologizing over and over, saying he barely knew the guy, that they'd only played flag football together a few times 2 years ago, that Wallace had just appeared at the party and asked for a ride. He swore he had no idea Wallace was like that, and I believed him because Andy looked almost as shaken as we did. Tricia and I spent the rest of the day cleaning the apartment, scrubbing every surface Wallace had touched, washing the bowl and spoon he'd used, throwing away the cereal box because neither of us could stomach eating from it again. We found a few things that confirmed our worst feelings about the night. The drawers in my bedroom had been opened and rifled through even though the door had been closed. A small jewelry box on my dresser had been moved to a different spot. Nothing was missing as far as I could tell. But knowing he'd been in there touching my things while I slept just a few feet away behind a locked door made me feel violated in a way I still can't fully describe. We changed the locks the next day. I didn't sleep well for weeks. I never saw Wallace again. But sometimes when I'm out in the city and I see a tall man with a shaved head, my whole body tenses up and I have to remind myself to breathe. Some lessons stay with you forever. And the one I learned that night was simple. Trust your instincts when someone makes you uncomfortable, because the cost of being polite can be way too high. Story number 5. The Knock. Colin showed up at my place around 9 p.m. with 2 bottles of cheap champagne and his girlfriend Whitney carrying a stack of frozen pizzas. Nothing crazy, just 4 of us total. Them, plus my neighbor Frank from 2 doors down who'd separated from his wife a couple months back and needed somewhere to be that night. My place is a small ranch-style house at the end of a cul-de-sac in a neighborhood outside Charlotte, North Carolina. Quiet street, mostly older couples and young families. The kind of place where people wave at each other but nobody really knows anybody that well. We had the music at a reasonable volume. Maybe a little louder during certain songs, but nothing that would make someone angry. Around 11:47, we heard the knock. It was firm. 3 solid hits on the front door. The kind of knock that makes you stop mid-sentence. Colin muted the speaker and we all just kind of looked at each other. Frank made a joke about it being the cops and we laughed because it seemed ridiculous. I got up and walked to the door. Through the small window next to it, I could see a guy standing on my porch, maybe mid-40s, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. He had his hands clasped in front of him like he was waiting patiently. I opened the door about halfway, leaving the chain on because something about the way he was standing made me want to keep a barrier there. He smiled when he saw me and said he was responding to a noise complaint, that someone had called about loud music. I asked him who complained and he just said it was anonymous, that he wasn't allowed to share that information. His voice was calm, almost too calm, like he'd rehearsed this conversation a dozen times before knocking. I noticed he didn't have a badge, no uniform, nothing that would indicate he was with the police or any kind of official noise enforcement. When I asked if he was a cop, He paused for just a second. A tiny hesitation that most people would miss. He said he was with the neighborhood association. That didn't sit right with me because I'd lived in that house for almost 3 years and never once heard of any neighborhood association. We didn't have an HOA. No community board. Nothing like that. I told him we'd keep it down and started to close the door. He put his hand on the frame. Not aggressively, but firmly enough that the door stopped moving. He said he needed to come inside to verify the noise level, that it was standard procedure. That's when Colin appeared behind me. He's a big guy, played football in high school and still lifts regularly. And I think his presence changed the dynamic immediately. The man on the porch took a small step back, his eyes shifting from me to Colin and back to me. I told him again that we'd keep it down, that there was no need for him to come inside, that I didn't know who he was. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of expression someone makes when they're trying to appear calm but are actually calculating something. He said fine, that he'd check back later. Then he turned and walked down the porch steps toward the sidewalk. I closed the door and locked it. Colin asked me what the hell that was about. I told him I had no idea, but something about the whole interaction made me uneasy. Whitney came over and asked if everything was okay. I said yes, but I walked to the front window and watched the man. He didn't go to a car. He walked to the end of my driveway and just stood there, looking back at the house. Frank joined me at the window and said that guy wasn't from around here. He knew most of the people on the street, at least by face, and he'd never seen this man before. We watched him for maybe 2 minutes. When someone is standing at the end of your driveway staring at your house in the dark, 2 minutes feels like forever. Then he turned and walked slowly down the sidewalk, disappearing around the curve of the cul-de-sac where the streetlight didn't reach. Colin suggested we call the police, but I hesitated. What would I even say? Some guy knocked on my door claiming to be from a neighborhood association and then stood in my driveway? It sounded ridiculous even in my own head. Whitney said we should at least lock all the doors and check the windows, which we did. I went through every room in the house, making sure the latches were secure. When I got to the back bedroom, I looked out into the backyard and saw nothing but darkness and the fence line. I told myself I was overreacting, that the guy was probably just some lonely weirdo who wanted attention on New Year's Eve. We tried to get back into the mood after that, but it was difficult. The music was playing again but quieter now. Nobody was really talking much. Frank kept glancing at the front window every few minutes. Whitney was texting someone. Colin was sitting on the couch with his arms crossed, looking irritated. I opened another beer and checked my phone. It was 12:03, which meant we'd missed the countdown completely. I hadn't even noticed midnight passing. That bothered me more than it should have. Like the whole night had been stolen by this stranger. Around 12:15, Colin said he was going to step outside for some air. I told him I'd go with him. We walked out the back door onto the small patio behind the kitchen. The night was cold but not unbearable. We could hear fireworks in the distance from other neighborhoods. Colin lit a cigarette and asked me if I recognized the guy at all. Maybe from work or somewhere else. I said no. I'd never seen him before in my life. We were outside for maybe 5 minutes when Colin suddenly stopped talking mid-sentence. He was looking past me toward the back corner of the yard where the fence meets the neighbor's property. I turned around and saw a figure standing there, just on the other side of the fence, barely visible in the darkness. It was him, the same guy. He wasn't moving, not saying anything, just standing there with his hands at his sides, watching us. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Colin grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the door. We got inside and he locked it immediately, then checked that the deadbolt was engaged. Whitney asked what happened and Colin told her the guy was in the backyard. or at least right outside it. Frank stood up from the couch and said we needed to call the police right now, that this wasn't normal behavior. I finally agreed. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, my fingers feeling clumsy and slow. The dispatcher answered and I tried to explain the situation as calmly as I could. A man had come to my door earlier, claimed to be from a neighborhood association, tried to get inside, and was now standing behind my fence watching us. The dispatcher asked if the man had made any direct threats or shown a weapon. I said no, not exactly, but he was clearly following us around the property. She said she'd send an officer to check it out, but it might take a while because of all the New Year's calls they were dealing with. Drunk drivers, domestic disputes, fireworks complaints. She told me to stay inside, keep the doors locked, and call back if the situation escalated. I hung up feeling frustrated and scared at the same time. Colin was pacing the living room. Whitney had moved to the center of the house away from any windows. Frank suggested we turn off all the lights so we could see outside better without being seen ourselves. Seemed like a good idea, so we did it. The house went dark except for the glow of the stove clock in the kitchen. I crept back to the window that looked out onto the backyard. The figure was gone. The spot by the fence where he'd been standing was empty. I told the others. Nobody knew if that was a good thing or a bad thing. For the next 20 minutes, we sat in the dark living room without saying much. Every small sound made us tense up. The refrigerator humming, the house settling, a car passing on the street outside. Whitney was holding Colin's hand. I could tell she was trying not to cry. Frank had found a baseball bat I keep in the hall closet and was gripping it like his life depended on it. I kept checking my phone, waiting for the police to call or show up. But nothing happened. Then around 12:45, we heard something that made all of us hold our breath. A slow, deliberate scraping sound, coming from the side of the house, like someone was dragging their fingers along the siding. It moved from the front toward the back, taking its time, as if the person doing it wanted us to hear every second of it. Colin stood up and moved toward the hallway. I followed him. We stopped at the window in the spare bedroom that looks out onto the narrow strip of grass between my house and the fence. We couldn't see anyone, but the sound continued, moving past us toward the backyard. Then it stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. I was about to say something when we heard 3 knocks on the back door. Not loud, not aggressive, just 3 calm, patient knocks, exactly like the ones on the front door earlier. Nobody moved. Whitney let out a small whimper from the living room. I walked slowly toward the kitchen, staying low, positioned myself where I could see the back door without being directly in front of it. The door has a small window at the top. Through it, I could see the outline of a face pressed close to the glass. Looking in, it was too dark to make out features, but I knew it was him. He knocked again, 3 more times. Then I heard his voice, muffled but clear enough to understand. He said he just wanted to talk, that he wasn't going to hurt anyone, that he'd been watching the house for a while and he knew there was a woman inside. The way he said it, the way he specified that he knew Whitney was there, made my entire body go cold. Colin lost it. He grabbed the bat from Frank and ran toward the back door, screaming at the guy to get the hell off his property before he caved his skull in. I'd never seen Colin that angry before. He was slamming his palm against the door, telling the man he had 5 seconds to disappear. The face in the window pulled back. We heard footsteps moving quickly across the patio. Then nothing. Colin was breathing hard, still gripping the bat, his whole body shaking with adrenaline. Whitney was crying now, asking what the hell was happening, why this guy was targeting us. I called 911 again and told them the situation had escalated. that the man had come to the back door and made comments about knowing there was a woman in the house. The dispatcher said an officer was on the way and should arrive within 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes felt like hours. We huddled in the hallway away from all the windows and doors, listening for any sound that might tell us where he was. Frank kept saying we should have left, driven away when we had the chance. But none of us had thought of that in the moment. The police finally showed up around 1:15 a.m. 2 officers, a man and a woman, both looking tired but alert. They searched the entire perimeter of the house with flashlights and found nothing. No sign of the man. No footprints they could identify in the grass. Nothing left behind. One of them asked me to describe the guy again. I did, but I could tell they didn't have much to go on. They said they'd file a report and increase patrols in the area for the next few nights. But without a name or a license plate, there wasn't much else they could do. After they left, nobody wanted to stay at my place. Colin and Whitney went home. Frank walked back to his house 2 doors down, though I watched him from the window until he got inside safely. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light on, the baseball bat next to me, checking the windows every few minutes until the sun came up. The man never came back. Not that night. Not the next day. Not ever. I never saw him again. Never found out who he was or why he chose my house. I asked around the neighborhood in the days that followed, but nobody else had seen him. It was like he appeared out of nowhere, terrorized us for a few hours, and then vanished. I installed a security camera system the following week, but the footage has never shown anything unusual. Sometimes I still think about that night, about the way he said he knew there was a woman inside, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd opened that door without the chain on, or if Colin hadn't been there. I try not to think about it too much, but every New Year's Eve since then, I make sure I'm not home. Story number 6. The Follower. The fireworks had been popping off since 9 p.m. By the time the last one fizzled out over the downtown skyline, my phone showed 1:47 in the morning. January 1st, 2024. I just turned 24 3 weeks before Christmas. Still adjusting to life in Austin after moving there for a nursing position at a small clinic near the University District. My roommate Chloe had stayed at her boyfriend's place for the holiday, which meant our little duplex on Maplewood Lane would be empty when I got back. The party I'd attended was only a mile and a half away, hosted by a coworker named Iris who'd become something like a friend over the past few months. I could have called a rideshare, probably should have, but the night air felt crisp and pleasant after hours inside a crowded living room. The neighborhood between her place and mine was entirely quiet residential blocks, the kind with neatly trimmed hedges and porch lights left on all night. I figured the walk would take 20 minutes at most, and the streets would be full of people heading home from their own celebrations. The first 10 minutes proved me right. Small groups wandered past, laughing and calling out to each other, some still holding champagne bottles and sparklers that had burned down to the handle. I passed a couple kissing against a mailbox, an older man walking a golden retriever, a cluster of teenagers taking selfies. My heels clicked against the pavement in a steady rhythm. I kept my purse tucked close to my side out of habit rather than genuine concern. Around the halfway mark, the crowds thinned considerably. The side streets grew darker, the spaces between street lights stretching longer. I noticed footsteps behind me somewhere around Oleander Drive, maybe 50 feet back, but I told myself it meant nothing. People walked home on New Year's Eve. That was normal. I glanced back once quickly and saw a figure in dark clothing, hands in pockets, moving at roughly my pace. A man, I thought, though the distance made it hard to tell for certain. I picked up my speed just slightly, not running, not panicking, just moving with a bit more purpose toward the familiar shape of my duplex 3 blocks ahead. By the time I reached my street, I'd almost convinced myself the whole thing had been in my head. The footsteps behind me had faded somewhere in the last block. Or maybe I just stopped hearing them over the sound of my own pulse drumming in my ears. Maplewood Lane looked exactly as it always did. A row of modest duplexes and single-family homes. Most of them dark except for the blue glow of televisions flickering behind curtains. My unit sat near the end of the cul-de-sac. The porch light on because I always left it on. The little ceramic frog Chloe had bought at a flea market guarding the welcome mat. I fumbled with my keys for a moment, my fingers clumsy from the cold and maybe something else I didn't want to name. The lock clicked open. I stepped inside, shut the door behind me, twisted the deadbolt into place. Then I stood there in the dark entryway for a long moment, just breathing, letting the silence of the empty house settle around me like a blanket. I told myself I was being ridiculous, paranoid, the kind of girl who watches too many true crime documentaries and sees danger in every shadow. I dropped my purse on the kitchen counter, poured myself a glass of water, scrolled through my phone for a few minutes while my heartbeat slowly returned to normal. Chloe had texted me a blurry photo of herself and her boyfriend kissing at midnight. Iris had posted a story of the remaining guests doing shots. Normal things, safe things. The world outside my window was just the same world it had always been, full of ordinary people doing ordinary things on a holiday night. I decided a hot shower would help shake off the lingering unease, wash away the smell of cigarette smoke and spilled beer that clung to my hair and clothes. The bathroom sat at the back of the duplex, a small space with a frosted window that faced the narrow strip of yard between our unit and the wooden fence separating us from the neighbors. I'd never given that window much thought before. It was frosted after all. Nobody could see in. I turned on the water, waited for it to heat up, started undressing without bothering to close the bathroom door since nobody else was home anyway. The shower felt incredible after hours on my feet, the hot water loosening the tension in my shoulders and neck. I stood under the stream with my eyes closed, letting the steam fill my lungs, thinking about nothing in particular. Maybe 5 minutes passed, maybe 10. I was rinsing conditioner from my hair when I heard something outside the window. Not loud, not a crash or a bang, just a soft sound, like fabric brushing against the exterior wall. I turned off the water and stood completely still, dripping onto the tile floor, straining to listen. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then I heard it again, a faint scraping noise, like someone shifting their weight on gravel. The strip of yard outside that window was covered in small decorative stones. Chloe and I had complained about them a dozen times because they got tracked inside whenever we used the back door. I knew exactly what those stones sounded like when you stepped on them, and someone was stepping on them right now, just a few feet from where I stood naked and dripping in the steam-filled bathroom. I didn't scream. I didn't make any sound at all. My body seemed to understand before my brain caught up that making noise would be the wrong move, that alerting whoever was out there to my awareness might change the situation in ways I couldn't predict. I grabbed my towel from the hook and wrapped it around myself with trembling fingers, my eyes fixed on that frosted window. The glass was thick and textured, impossible to see through clearly, but I could make out the vague shape of the fence posts and the dark outline of the neighbor's roof beyond. Nothing else. No figure. No movement. No shadow that didn't belong. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, barely breathing, water pooling around my feet and soaking into the bath mat. Then I saw it. A pale glow appearing at the lower edge of the window frame, faint and bluish, the unmistakable light of a phone screen. It hovered there for maybe 3 seconds before disappearing. Someone was standing outside my bathroom window in the middle of the night, and they'd just checked their phone, or taken a photo, or done something that required looking at a screen. The realization hit me like ice water flooding my veins. I moved without thinking, pressing myself flat against the wall beside the door, as far from that window as the small bathroom would allow. My phone was in the kitchen, sitting on the counter next to my purse, where I'd left it like an idiot. The bathroom had no lock on the inside, just a simple door that swung shut but never latched properly. One of those minor annoyances Chloe and I kept saying we'd ask the landlord to fix. I forced myself to breathe slowly, quietly, trying to hear past the pounding of my own heart. The stones outside crunched again, softer this time. Then there was nothing. Complete silence. I counted to 60 in my head, then counted again, my legs shaking beneath me, my skin prickling with goosebumps despite the lingering warmth of the steam. When I finally worked up the courage to move, I crept out of the bathroom in a low crouch, still wrapped in my towel, heading for the kitchen without turning on any lights. Every shadow in the hallway looked like a person. Every creak of the old floorboards sounded like footsteps behind me. I reached my phone and immediately dialed 911, whispering into the receiver as I crouched behind the kitchen island with my back pressed against the cabinets. The dispatcher asked me to repeat myself twice because my voice came out so quiet and shaky. I told her someone was outside my house, that I'd seen a light at my bathroom window, that I thought someone had followed me home. She asked if I'd seen the person directly, if they'd tried to enter the property, if I was somewhere safe inside the residence. I answered no, and I think so, feeling stupid and hysterical and terrified all at once. She told me officers were on the way, that I should stay on the line and stay away from doors and windows. I sat there on the cold kitchen tile in my damp towel, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the silence of my empty house and the distant pop of leftover fireworks somewhere across the city. 7 minutes passed before I saw the red and blue lights sweep across the living room curtains. Felt like 7 hours. The dispatcher told me the officers were approaching the front door, that I could let them in when I heard them knock. 2 sharp raps came a moment later, followed by a voice announcing the police. I've never moved so fast in my life to unlock a door and let strangers inside. 2 officers came in, a woman with short gray hair and a younger guy who looked barely older than me. I must have looked insane standing there in a towel with wet hair dripping down my back, stammering about noises and phone lights and someone following me from a party. But they took it seriously. The woman, Officer Dunlap according to her name tag, asked me to show her which window I meant while her partner went outside to check the perimeter. I led her to the bathroom and pointed at the frosted glass, feeling embarrassed now, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing or blown some innocent noise out of proportion. She shined her flashlight through the window from the inside, illuminating nothing but the dark yard beyond. I started mentally preparing an apology for wasting their time on New Year's Eve. Then her radio crackled. The younger officer's voice came through, tight and clipped. He said he needed her outside, east side of the property. Something in his tone made both of us go still. Officer Dunlap told me to stay inside and lock the door behind her, which I did, watching through the kitchen window as their flashlight beams swept across the narrow strip of yard. They found footprints in the decorative stones, a clear trail of them leading from the back corner of the property to the spot directly beneath my bathroom window. The stones had been disturbed in a rough circle there, pressed down and scattered, like someone had stood in that exact spot for a while, shifting their weight back and forth. Officer Dunlap showed me photos on her phone after they finished documenting everything. I recognized the pattern immediately, the same soft crunching sound I'd heard, the same restless movement of someone waiting. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what the younger officer found near the fence line. Half hidden in the shadow of an overgrown bush. A cigarette butt, still fresh. The filter stained with something dark that might have been lipstick or might have been blood. And next to it, pressed into the soft dirt beneath the bush, a knee print. Someone had knelt there in the darkness beside my fence, watching my house for long enough to smoke an entire cigarette down to the filter. The officers asked me again about the person I'd seen following me. What they looked like, how tall, what they were wearing. I could barely remember anything useful. Dark clothes, average height, hands in pockets. Could have been anyone. Could have been nobody. But someone had followed me home and waited outside my window. And I had no idea why. The officers stayed for almost an hour, taking my statement, checking every door and window in the duplex. Officer Dunlap gave me her card and told me to call if I noticed anything else. If I saw anyone unfamiliar around the property. If I remembered any other details about the figure on the street. She also suggested I stay somewhere else for the night if I could, just to be safe. And something about the way she said it made me understand that she was more worried than she was letting on. I called Chloe the moment they left. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep and confusion. When I told her what happened, she went quiet for a long moment before telling me to pack a bag and come to her boyfriend's apartment immediately. I threw on clothes without really looking at what I grabbed, stuffed some things into my backpack, ordered a rideshare with trembling fingers. The whole time, I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see a face staring back at me from the darkness, expecting to hear those soft footsteps on the gravel again. The car arrived in 4 minutes. I practically ran out the front door, locking it behind me, climbing into the back seat without looking back at the house. I stayed at Chloe's boyfriend's place for 3 nights before I felt ready to go back to the duplex. We installed motion sensor lights in the backyard that same week. Chloe's boyfriend helped us put a lock on the bathroom door and a secondary deadbolt on the back entrance. I started carrying pepper spray in my purse, and I never walked home alone after dark again. Not once. Not even for a few blocks. The police never caught whoever it was. They increased patrols on our street for a couple weeks. One detective called me in late January to ask if I'd noticed anything suspicious since then. But there were no leads, no suspects, no answers. Sometimes I wonder if it was random. If I just happened to be walking alone at the wrong time and caught the attention of someone dangerous. Other times I wonder if they'd been watching me before that night, learning my patterns, waiting for an opportunity. I still live in Austin, still work at the same clinic, but I moved to a different apartment complex last spring. One with security cameras in the parking lot and a doorman at the front entrance. I sleep better now than I did in those first few months after New Year's. But every once in a while, when I come home late from a shift and the street is quiet and empty, I catch myself checking behind me, counting the footsteps, listening for the sound of someone matching my pace in the darkness. Some part of me is still back there on Maplewood Lane, standing in that steam-filled bathroom, watching a pale blue light appear at the edge of my window and knowing with absolute certainty that I was not alone. Story number 7. The Celebration. That night unfolded during a New Year's public celebration downtown. The kind with temporary stages, food trucks, and countdown screens tied to streetlights. I was living in a small apartment a few blocks away, sharing the place with 2 friends. Life felt steady back then. Busy jobs, late dinners, that fragile optimism people carry into a new year. We met a couple of friends at the event. Nothing wild, just drinks and paper cups and talking over music that bled into every street. When the fireworks ended and people surged toward the main avenues, We decided to walk back together instead of fighting the crowd. The idea was simple: cut through quieter blocks, get home faster, crash. I remember feeling relaxed, slightly buzzed, ready to be indoors. None of us were in a rush, and that calm would make the shift later feel even sharper. The moment we turned onto the first side street, the city changed its tone. The music dulled into a distant thump. The laughter became scattered, like it had holes in it. Our group stayed tight, shoes scraping against pavement littered with confetti and crushed cups. Street lights were spaced farther apart here, each one creating a pool of yellow that felt isolated rather than comforting. Someone joked about how quiet it suddenly was. Another laughed too loudly in response. That's when I noticed movement behind us, reflected faintly in a dark storefront window. Shapes, not clear enough to count yet, moving at a pace that matched ours. I didn't say anything at first, convincing myself it was just other people heading home the same way. As we walked, the awareness wouldn't leave. I glanced back more directly this time and caught several figures trailing us, spaced out, careful not to bunch together. They didn't shout, didn't close the distance, didn't even look hurried. Their presence was defined by restraint, which somehow made it worse. When we crossed an intersection and took a sharper turn than necessary, I listened for footsteps changing rhythm behind us. They did. The sound echoed a beat later, delayed but intentional. One of my friends whispered my name, asking if I saw them too. That confirmation snapped the last thread of denial. We weren't imagining it, and we weren't alone anymore in the way we wanted to be. We picked up our pace, not running, just enough to test the situation. The figures responded without hesitation, adjusting speed with us, still keeping that measured gap. Light from the next block looked thinner. The buildings grew taller, squeezing the street into a narrow corridor. When we veered toward what should have led back to a busier road, the figures spread slightly, forcing us to stay straight instead. That was the instant the pattern clicked into place. This wasn't random overlap or coincidence. It was guidance without words. The realization pressed down on my chest as we were nudged farther from noise, from open doors, from anywhere help might casually exist. Every step after that carried the weight of knowing we were being steered. The silence between us thickened as we moved, broken only by the uneven rhythm of our breathing and the soft scuff of shoes behind us. No one suggested calling for help out loud, and I think we all knew why. Shouting would have meant stopping, turning, exposing ourselves. Phones were out, screens dimmed instinctively, as if light itself could betray us. I remember the smell of damp concrete and old trash, sharper than it should have been, like my senses were overcorrecting. The figure stayed just far enough back to avoid being caught in direct light. Faces swallowed by shadow, outlines dissolving whenever we tried to focus on details. That distance felt calculated, like a leash held loose on purpose. We reached a stretch where the street lights thinned even more, one of them flickering like it was deciding whether to stay on. Someone muttered that this wasn't right, that we should cut through a courtyard ahead to reach a more open block. As soon as we slowed to change direction, the figures shifted again, spreading wider, occupying the edges of the street without ever fully blocking it. The message landed without words. Keep moving forward. My mouth went dry. Every plan I tried to form collapsed before it could take shape. They didn't rush us, didn't threaten us, didn't need to. Control didn't come from speed or force, came from certainty. At one point I tried something small, almost pathetic in hindsight. I dropped my keys, letting them clatter loudly against the pavement, bent to pick them up slower than necessary. The idea was to see if they'd close in. They didn't. Instead, they stopped too, freezing the space behind us into a silent standstill. That pause was worse than movement. Felt like an acknowledgement, like they knew exactly why I did it and wanted me to know they were paying attention. When I straightened and started walking again, they followed. Footsteps resuming in perfect sync, as if the street itself had learned how to breathe behind us. We were nearing a stretch of buildings with no windows at street level. Long blank walls that reflected sound in strange ways. My heart hammered so hard it felt visible, like it might show through my jacket. One of my friends whispered that we needed people, like anything, pointed toward a narrow passage that cut between two buildings. It wasn't ideal, but it was unpredictable. We turned into it suddenly, all of us at once, shoes slipping slightly on damp ground. For a split second, the footsteps behind us stopped. That moment of absence carried its own terror, heavier than pursuit, because it meant they were deciding what to do next. The passage was tighter than it looked from the street, boxed in by brick walls that trapped every sound we made. Our footsteps bounced back at us, distorted, making it hard to tell what was real and what was echo. About halfway through, we realized the silence behind us hadn't lasted. Footsteps returned, closer now, no longer bothering with distance. The figures had committed to the turn, their pace quicker, more confident, like the decision had already been made before we even acted. Panic shifted into something colder and sharper, the kind that forces your mind to work faster even while your body wants to shut down. I could hear someone in our group quietly crying, trying to keep it contained, which somehow made everything feel more exposed. The passage opened into a small service road with a single working light buzzing overhead. In that harsh glow, I finally caught clearer glimpses of them. There were at least 4, maybe 5, dressed in layers that didn't stand out individually but blended together into a uniform of dark fabric and stillness. No one said a word. Their faces stayed angled just enough to avoid being fully seen. But their attention was unmistakably fixed on us. One of them raised a hand, not pointing, not waving, just lifting it slightly. The others adjusted their positions without looking at each other. That small gesture told me everything I needed to know about how coordinated this was. Adrenaline pushed us to move again, this time faster, nearly breaking into a run. The road sloped upward toward a block where I knew there were residential buildings, balconies, maybe even someone awake. The figures followed. But now the gap was smaller, the intention less hidden. I could hear the scrape of their shoes clearly, each step deliberate. We reached a corner where light spilled out from a convenience store at the end of the block, its windows glowing like something unreal. Without speaking, we sprinted for it, abandoning any attempt at subtlety. Behind us, footsteps accelerated too, finally loud, finally honest about what they were doing. We burst into the light, breath ragged, nearly colliding with a couple standing outside the store. The figures stopped just short of the glow, their outlines retreating instinctively, as if light itself drew a boundary they wouldn't cross. They didn't scatter or run. They simply stepped back, melting into darker streets with the same discipline they'd shown all night. We stayed there longer than necessary, shaking, trying to explain ourselves in half-sentences to confused strangers. Eventually, we took the long way home, sticking to crowded roads, lights, noise. To this day, I don't know who they were or what would have happened if we hadn't reached that store. But I do know this. They weren't lost. They weren't drunk. And they weren't curious. They knew exactly where they wanted us to go. And that's what still keeps me awake some nights. Story number 8. The Watcher at the Window. The New Year's Eve I'm about to describe happened during a phase of my life that felt pretty ordinary. I was renting a small 2-story house on a quiet residential block. working long hours during the week, keeping mostly to myself. That night, my plan was simple. Stay home. Watch the fireworks from the upstairs window. Maybe drink a beer or two. Be asleep shortly after midnight. I'd lived on that block long enough to recognize every porch light and every familiar car. So there was a false sense of safety baked into the routine. Everyone was excited for the countdown. Kids were running up and down the sidewalks. The air already smelled like smoke from early fireworks. It felt like one of those nights where nothing out of the ordinary could possibly happen. As the evening went on, the neighborhood grew louder in waves. Fireworks popped in uneven bursts. Car alarms chirped and died. People shouted greetings across the street like they were all part of one big shared moment. I remember standing in my kitchen around 10 p.m. rinsing a glass when I noticed how often headlights were slowing near my house. At first, I brushed it off as people looking for parking spots or pulling over to let others pass. Still, there was a pattern to it that stuck in my head. The way the engines idled just a little longer than necessary before moving on. I told myself I was overthinking it. The way you sometimes do when you're alone and the night stretches out too quietly between explosions. Closer to midnight, I went upstairs to my bedroom, which faces the street. From there, I could see almost the entire block lit up by flashes of color. Reds and greens bouncing off the windows and cars. I leaned against the frame and watched silhouettes move between houses. Neighbors drifting from one yard to another with drinks in hand. Somewhere down the block, someone had a speaker blasting music that distorted every time a firework went off. That's when I noticed a darker shape near the side of my house, close to where the fence meets the garage. It wasn't obvious. Just a patch where the light didn't behave the same way, like something was absorbing it. By the time another firework burst overhead, the shape was gone. Midnight hit in a blur of noise so intense it felt physical, like pressure against my chest. Cheers erupted. Horns blared. The sky was so bright it almost looked like daylight for a few seconds at a time. I stayed at the window, watching sparks rain down and smoke drift between the houses. That's when I heard it. A dull metallic scrape from downstairs, completely swallowed by the celebration outside. It wasn't loud enough to stand out, but it was distinct, wrong in a way that didn't match the chaos of fireworks. I stood there frozen in place, listening hard while the neighborhood screamed its way into the new year, unaware that something else was happening right inside my house. I waited until the noise outside dipped just enough for my ears to separate sounds again. Downstairs, there was a pause followed by a faint click, like someone testing something gently instead of forcing it. My heart was racing, but my body felt heavy, like it didn't want to cooperate. I stepped into the hallway and eased my bedroom door open, careful not to let the hinge complain. From the top of the stairs, I could see the front door area lit only by the blinking glow of fireworks sneaking through the curtains. Everything looked normal at first glance, but there was a tension in the air that made my throat dry. I remember thinking how surreal it was that people were hugging and celebrating outside while my house felt like it was holding its breath. I crept down a few steps and noticed the front door handle was angled slightly downward, not fully at rest. That alone made my pulse spike because I'm obsessive about checking locks, especially on nights like that. I stood there listening, counting my breaths, trying to decide if I was imagining things. Then I heard it again, softer this time, like fabric brushing against wood near the door frame. Whoever it was moved slowly, deliberately, counting on the noise outside to cover every mistake. Fireworks cracked overhead, bright enough to cast shadows through the window. In those brief flashes, I saw the outline of a shoulder pulling back from the door. I backed up without thinking, my foot brushing the stair rail hard enough to make a faint tap. For a split second, everything stopped. The sounds outside continued, but inside the house, there was absolute stillness. I stood there halfway between floors, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. Then the front door handle returned to its normal position, slow and careful, as if whoever touched it didn't want to leave a trace. A moment later, I heard footsteps retreat across the porch, light and controlled. I rushed back upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom, phone clenched in my hand, staring at the door while the sky outside exploded in color. The celebration felt mocking now, like the world was laughing at how close something bad had come. When things finally quieted down, I didn't sleep. As dawn crept in, I worked up the nerve to check the house. The front door showed fresh scratches around the lock, thin lines that caught the light when I tilted my head just right. Outside, the fence gate was unlatched. Muddy shoe prints led from my yard toward the next house, then vanished on the sidewalk. A few hours later, neighbors started talking. 3 homes on the same block had signs of attempted entry, all during the loudest moments of the night. Someone had moved methodically from house to house, using fireworks and cheers as camouflage. I changed my locks that week and installed cameras. But the part that stays with me is how easy it was for someone to blend danger into celebration, knowing exactly when no one would be paying attention. Story number 9. The countdown. It ended without anyone getting hurt, and for that I'm grateful, even if I still check my locks twice when the fireworks start. That night taught me something I wish I didn't know, that distractions don't just steal attention. They invite the wrong kind of patience. The evening started normally enough. I was downtown with friends at one of those massive public New Year celebrations. Temporary stages, food trucks, countdown screens everywhere. We'd been drinking, nothing crazy, just enough to feel warm and loose and part of something bigger than ourselves. When midnight hit, the whole city seemed to scream at once. Fireworks exploded overhead in waves. Confetti cannons fired into the crowd. Strangers hugged and kissed and cheered like the future was guaranteed to be better. For those first few minutes after the countdown, everything felt perfect. Then we decided to head home. The main streets were packed with people trying to get rides or walk to parking garages. So we took a side route, cutting through quieter blocks to avoid the crush. That's when I first noticed them. A group of 4 or 5 people, maybe 20 feet behind us, moving at exactly our pace. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Lots of people were walking home. It was New Year's Eve, but as we turned corners, they turned too. When we sped up slightly, they matched us. When we slowed down to check a street sign, they slowed down too. My friend Sarah noticed it around the same time I did. She grabbed my arm and whispered that something felt off. We were on a narrow street now, older buildings on both sides, most of the windows dark. The celebration noise from downtown fading into something distant and muffled. I glanced back and got a better look at them this time, all wearing dark clothing, hoods up, faces obscured, moving with this coordinated precision that made my stomach drop. They weren't just walking the same direction. They were following us. We picked up our pace, not running yet, but walking fast enough that it was clear we were trying to get away. They matched us instantly. No hesitation. No conversation between them that I could see. Just this fluid adjustment that told me they'd done this before. Sarah pulled out her phone to call someone. Maybe 911. Maybe her boyfriend. But before she could dial, one of them called out. A man's voice, calm and almost friendly. He said, "Hey, wait up. We just want to talk." Everything about that sentence was wrong. The tone, the timing, the way he phrased it like we were old friends who'd gotten separated in the crowd. We didn't stop. We didn't respond. We just kept walking faster. Sarah managed to connect her call. started whispering urgently to whoever was on the other end, giving them street names, saying we needed help. That's when they started closing the distance. Not running, but walking faster, more purposeful. Like they'd decided we weren't going to make this easy, so they'd stop pretending. My heart was slamming against my ribs, my breath coming in short gasps even though we hadn't been walking that long. Fear does that. Makes your body react before your mind fully catches up. We turned onto a slightly wider street, one with a few more lights, a few more buildings that looked occupied. I could see a bodega at the end of the block, its windows bright and welcoming. An older man standing outside smoking a cigarette. We made a run for it. Behind us, I heard their footsteps accelerate, shoes pounding against pavement. No more pretense. No more patience. They were chasing us now, openly, brazenly, like they didn't care who saw. We reached the bodega and practically fell through the door. Sarah was crying. Another friend was shouting for help. The man behind the counter looked startled, then alarmed, then immediately pulled out his phone. Through the window, I watched them slow down, stop about 15 feet from the storefront, standing there in a loose cluster, looking at us through the glass. For a long moment, nobody moved. It was this horrible standoff where we were safe but trapped. And they were just waiting. The man in the bodega was on the phone with police, speaking rapidly in Spanish, gesturing at the window. One of the figures outside lifted a hand, gave us a little wave, almost mocking, like they wanted us to know they weren't scared. Then they turned and walked away, disappearing back into the side streets we just escaped from. Police arrived about 10 minutes later. We gave descriptions, explained what happened, but without any physical contact or direct threats, there wasn't much they could do. They drove us home, made sure we got inside safely, said they'd increase patrols in that area. But everyone knew the truth. Those people were gone, absorbed back into the city, waiting for the next celebration, the next distraction, the next group of people who thought they were safe just because they weren't alone. I still go out on New Year's Eve, still celebrate with friends, but I don't take shortcuts anymore. Don't walk through empty streets even when the main roads are crowded. Because I learned something that night that I can't unlearn. Danger doesn't take holidays. It just waits for moments when we're too distracted to notice it coming.